What? So we're depleting all of our military stockpiles, engaged in an endless war and supporting in a great power conflict in an area of the world which its GDP share is rapidly diminishing. Meanwhile, our actual allies who are useful and actually pay their bills and produce useful things are under threat in the East. And no. So by pouring all of our attention and stockpiles over here, that's how we supported them over there. It doesn't even, it doesn't even pass the smell test at a very basic level, but you just invent these things like out of whole cloth. Or then the other one is like, we're depleting our greatest enemy's military for only 5% of our military budget. I'm like, yeah, well, we're also getting ourselves closer to a nuclear exchange for only 5%. Or no, so it's either a good deal or it's actually a terrible deal.
Tell anybody, like, Vladimir Putin is a center left politician by Russian standards, right?
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's an anti-nationalist, right? So in Russia you can distinguish between Ruskiya and Rossiyskiya. Like, Russian is in like ethnicity versus Russian is in Russian Federation. He's been a big advocate always for the more like federative civil nationalism. He's maintained the kind of Soviet they call it like affirmative action policy, but like he's maintained a lot of non-ethnic Russian people in his government. Dmitry Shoigu, the defense minister, is not ethnic Russian. He's probably by far, I mean, I think he's up there, if not by far, the most like not anti-Semitic or like philo-Semitic leader in Russia's history.
Really?
Like very overtly welcoming and building ties with Jews in Russia and in Israel, with Muslims. So he's like a center-left figure. Like, any of the candidates to replace Putin, any of the real candidates, is more reactionary and right-wing than he is.
MSNBC hardest hit.
Yeah. So this notion that like there's going to be a liberal democratic revolution in Russia just is completely a fantasy.
Yeah. Even Navalny was like more right wing than him. Right?
I don't know, more right wing, but and Navalny definitely kind of plays to the crowd a little bit. But historically, Navalny's engaged in like nationalist rhetoric. He's not like a. At least he didn't used to be a kind of like
Gary
Brooklyn
Kasparov
liberal.
is not going to be the.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember Navalny did this interview like right at the start of the invasion, like basically in support of it right off the bat. Like, he was like, yeah, we're never going to give these territories back. Like, what do you mean? Why would we do that? And then he noticed he stopped getting invited to go on these international television shows, and so he changed his tune pretty quickly. But that was at least right off the bat what he was saying.
Yeah. So, but what I mean by regime change is the Russian regime from. You can date it back to Yeltsin 1993 when, with Clinton's encouragement, they shelled the parliament, or maybe when Putin takes over in 2000, or more recent, I think maybe more recently. But the system that's developed is one basically where the bargain is you let the security elites control the country, and they're going to keep out what they see as like noxious foreign influences, and they'll take their primo cut, to compensate themselves. And in exchange, you get a pretty nice life, and a better life than anyone in Russia has ever lived. Right? You get oil revenues trickling down through the state to different sectors. You get a reasonably open economy. You can travel if you have money. You can travel to Europe. You can travel other places in Russia or the former Soviet Union. You have the internet. You can pirate whatever you want from the West, by the way. That's kind of the deal, right? So it's a demobilized and controlled civil society in exchange for a pretty okay quality of life, right? But the kind of extraordinary sanctions regime we've built around Russia since the invasion basically makes that bargain impossible. In addition to the fact that Russia's like massively operationally losing this war or not achieving their objectives. So on the one hand, they need to mobilize to have the resources to avoid ignominious defeat. On the other hand, they can't provide the same kind of quality of life that they have kind of implicitly promised in the social contract.
How much of this was at the elite level, like specifically the wealthiest Russians having this ability to basically part of kind of the transnational elite world, have apartments in Manhattan and London and in Berlin and kind of have your yachts and be able to basically go around the world unmolested? How much of the newly discovered weakness in that system is going to be because they can't do that anymore?
That's an interesting question. Part of the neocon Davos theory of change here seems to be that, like, if we just squeeze these oligarchs, if they can't have their mistresses in Manhattan, then they'll cry uncle and they'll depose Putin and it'll be great. And I'm very skeptical of this. Like, we forget that there are other motivations people can have. And I think by and large, the people at the very top of the Russian system are actually quite nationalist. I mean, like, it's funny. There's this line of criticism of Putin that he's like the world's wealthiest man. He's like insanely corrupt. And there isn't, obviously there's almost truth to that. But it doesn't have it doesn't land the way people think, because obviously if Putin was he's not just a kleptocrat, right? He's not just someone who's looting the state so he can live a nice life. He actually could have done lots of different things to endear himself to the West, to global elites, to have even more. But when you have everything materially, that's not what you're about, right? Putin is in it for his legacy.
Yeah, he has romantic, desires.
Yeah, he has an aspiration to be, a figure up there with Peter the Great. That's kind of what got him into trouble in Ukraine. I mean, I think at the very highest levels of the Russian state, there's also quite a strong sense of nationalism, right? And also, let's be real, ever since 2014, the implicit bargain Putin has made with his elites is you will be compensated. If the West takes your assets, you will be compensated. And yes, Khan is like nicer than the Black Sea coast, but if you have a mega yacht you can have a mega yacht in the Black Sea coast, right? You can have your nice apartment in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's not quite the same, but it's not like
clubs
a bad
in Shanghai
life.
aren't as good as the clubs in Berlin.
Yeah, exactly. So the ability to
close.
actually meaningfully address like these people materially is, I also think, I'm skeptical of that proposition.
Yeah, this was really interesting too. You saw this with the planes situation, right? You had all these Russian airlines that were leasing planes from American companies, and because of the sanctions, they demanded those planes back. Putin was like, "Yeah, I'll issue you guys certificates of airworthiness from the Russian government, and you can just flip the bird to those American." And that's exactly what they did. I mean, almost all of those planes are still flying now. I think one of the other like really terrible comparisons, it's especially beyond the pale, within the conservative movement, is that Putin is working on creating a new Soviet Union, right? Like he's trying to bring it back. What's wrong with that sort of prediction?
I mean, I think it's one thing briefly before I turn to that question. Various social scientists conduct these global surveys of popular opinion and values or whatever. And one of the things that's been true for over 20 years is that Russia is one of the highest in the world, maybe the highest, where everyday people say, it is important for me that I live in a great country. Like, it's important for me personally that I live in a country that's like respected and abroad, right? So when something like this happens, like with the planes, the average everyday Russian response is, for lack of a better word, like solidarity with like the Russian government. There's a weird way in which, I don't think the crackdown, even though it's worse in quality of life across Russia, even though they're in different places, there's a certain amount of resentment or fear about the way the war is going, mobilization. In principle, the idea that like we are under attack, we need to band together is like a very deeply rooted Russian idea. It's not going anywhere.
Well, and I think we would do the same thing too, right? Like if China tried to take all the planes that American Airlines, United had, we'd say F you, dude.
Yes.
Like, you suck.
Yes, absolutely.
We hate you.
Yeah, and the lack of like mirror imaging and empathy in American foreign policy elite is astounding. I mean, who was it? H.R. McMaster wrote this book on strategic empathy a couple years ago, and it's just completely laughable. I wrote a review for it for Responsible Statecraft, because it's like we don't know how to do empathy. We don't have Ray Charles Master, his idea of strategic empathy with the Chinese is literally writing about like a museum exhibit he went to, and he's been to China like 2 times, maybe.
I never want to hear those 2 words together again. But you were talking about the Soviet Union, remaking.
Yeah. So why is it a bad idea? So it's based on the misunderstanding. There's this famous speech where Putin laments that. But he says that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And people have taken this to mean, he wants to put it back together. And that's not at all what he meant. What he meant was something more straightforward, which was like, this would caused an incredible amount of chaos for a huge region of which Russia is sort of the center, right? The Soviet system was never going to be rebuildable, but there's also never been a power vacuum. Like nature and politics abhor a vacuum. From the Russian perspective, the Soviet international order, if you want to call it that, when it collapsed, left a vacuum. And if Russia didn't fill it, other people will, which is, of course, exactly what we've seen, right? Thanks to, the vacuum in Eastern Europe was filled by the EU and the West. For a long time, Russia basically maintained its kind of relations with Central Asia, and over kind of particularly in the last 20 years developed this sort of relationship where the Central Asian states liked playing Russia and China off each other. They didn't want to kind of be in the middle. The Chinese have gained increasing economic influence. The Russians maintain their political influence, but that's basically collapsing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You're seeing all the Central Asian countries take overt stances against what Russia is doing, implicitly aligning more closely with China. So the Russian attempt to even kind of preserve some semblance of a regional order in which they are in the center, which has sort of been the goal of Russian grand strategy since Ivan III, that's like in great peril right now. And that's also why they feel so under threat.
The craziest thing that's happened maybe from the Russia-Ukraine war, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. It's one of these things that I think we'll look back on in 15 years. And when people, like me and Dan Caldwell and others are considered right about this conflict, this is one of the points that they will say, oh yeah, that was obvious. That should have been a bigger problem. Remember when we imposed sanctions on the Russian economy that people described as a financial nuclear bomb, and nothing happened? Russian GDP barely shrank at all compared to its economic peers. It looks even better. Their ability to get around the sanctions by, let's say, mixing their petroleum with trace amounts of other nations' petroleum, the willingness of Iran and other nations to sell Russian petroleum by another name and Russian gas, we set off what everybody thought was the most important American financial weapon, and nothing happened. And that is crazy. And if you're Iran, and one of the most important things that happened in your nation's history in the past 30 years is that America destroyed the Iraq economy with sanctions, and you say, man, that's really scary, right? We don't want to do that. So we're going to listen to the Americans when they tell us what to do. But now we try to do the same thing to Russia, and it completely failed. I think that we made a huge mistake. I don't think that we were nearly prepared enough for how good the Russians would be at evading the sanctions. And I think it's done incredible damage to our credibility. And that's another reason you see these guys joining closer together.
What's it been like to be one of the few organizations that has actually taken a dissident view on foreign policy in this town, and to fight up against the legacy infrastructure that would try to put its thumb down on that as quickly as possible?
I mean, it's the same ethos in terms of the left and the right will call you names. You're a appeaser. You're an isolationist. You didn't learn the lesson from Munich. I mean, it's amazing. All of the paradigms go back to.
Have you been called Neville Chamberlain yet?
We've been called it. We've been called it all. And so we have a certain kind of hardness, having experienced that on other issues of being called names before. But it is so important. We don't have a school that exists that is developed with enough of the people that I know you are a part of raising up, that exist to be able to have these paradigm shifting foreign policies that honestly I think keep us safer as a country, won't have us so exhausted, won't have the rest of the world hating our guts. and is actually sustainable. And I'd love what Dan's thoughts were, but because he's been a part of building this movement for a long time, and I'm glad he's taking his talents to our organization.
The foreign policy community here in DC is just the good news is that there's an increasing counter elite. There's an increasing set of institutions that are willing to challenge the status quo and push back against this essentially uniparty foreign policy that's existed for the last 30 years, with kind of a break occurring under the Trump administration. But in large part, and this has become quite apparent during the Ukraine war, is that it is still decrepit. It's still kind of like the so-called budget hawk community. There's a lot of people just recycling the same old ideas, not taking responsibility or being held accountable for their failures. And I think even worse is that a lot of them have just allowed themselves to become mouthpieces and bagmen for special interests, in a lot of cases foreign interests. A lot of the foreign policy work you see coming out of institutions like the Atlantic Council, the Hudson Institute, and others are essentially financed and paid for by foreign governments. And it's not just financed or paid for. A lot of cases, it's line edited by representatives of foreign embassies. So you have a group of so-called American foreign policy scholars that are prioritizing the interests of foreign governments in their work, and it's disgusting. So in my previous role at Stand Together, is we were helping to build that counter league. We worked with groups like American Moment and Center for Renewing America, but also organizations like Defense Priorities, the Quincy Institute, other organizations like that were willing to challenge the status quo. And fortunately, there has been momentum there. But the Ukraine war has revealed that the traditional foreign policy establishment still has a lot of power, still has, unfortunately, way too much influence on Capitol Hill, even if there has been progress. So that was a big reason why, as well, I was excited to join Center for Renewing America, because they were willing to leverage their credibility in this fight, particularly among members on the right, where I think there's actually the most fertile ground to make progress at the moment.
If I had to define the tactical center of gravity on realism and restraint over the past 10 years, it was probably very intellectual and very academic. Where do you think the limitations of that approach have been, being now in a very tactical day-to-day grappling kind of role with what's going on in the Hill, and presumably if we got a presidential administration, what would be going on there, and what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I think that for a long time, you had the people that were solid on foreign policy. They were dispersed, they're limited in number, and I'll just be frank, a lot of them are friends of mine, but they almost developed a nihilistic view that their efforts were pointless. There was a Wall Street Journal editorial board writer who, in 2004, right before George W. Bush was elected, he effectively described the realism restraint movement as 4 or 5 guys in a phone booth from the Cato Institute and the American Conservative. It's no longer 4 or 5 guys, thankfully, in a phone booth. It's a real movement with both people in the academic space and the think tank space and in the activist level. When we have an activist call through our sister organization, Citizens for Renewing America, almost every call, Ukraine comes up. So this isn't a top.
It's amazing to watch. You go to a local Tea Party meeting or a Republican club meeting. This is something that the base cares about.
And I think this gets to an important point, is that there's a lot of conversation right now in DC about, was the opposition to Ukraine aid driven solely by people like Tucker Carlson or President Trump? And I think there is a lot of truth to that, but a lot of that was bottom up. It wasn't top down. And it's because a lot of the communities where the activists on the right were coming from, those were the ones that were most impacted by our failed foreign policy over not just the last 20 years, but the last 30 years. So I think that's the key difference now is that you have an actual movement, you have an activist right that is more engaged on this, and that's created the conditions where we can actually make progress on this issue, particularly on the right.
Keeping in mind that from a language perspective, this is a family-friendly show, what is y'all's reaction to that quote that appeared in Axios from a Republican member of Congress saying that he's glad that Tucker Carlson's off the air?
You're gonna have to probably edit this out. You told me not to bang the table, but first of all, man up and put your name on it.
Yeah.
And I'd say that too to the military officers
Because Pentagon
yeah.
officials and Republican members of Congress have been saying they're glad Tucker's gone.
You know, you're a military officer. You're supposedly I don't know this family friend. You're supposedly a bad, special forces guy who's working in the Pentagon, probably plotting on how to give Azov Battalion, anti-tank missiles, but whatever. And you don't have the courage to put your name on something. At least Mitt Romney had the guts to come out and say what he actually thought. But that ranting aside, it was very revealing. And the fact that they weren't willing to put their name on it, I'm talking about the members of Congress, because they know it's not really just Tucker Carlson. Don't get me wrong, he was a hugely important voice on this. But they know it's a larger movement, and in a lot of ways, Tucker was reflecting where their constituents were on this issue. So there's a lot of anonymous trash talking going on, but the fact that it's anonymous shows that they know that, let's be honest, Tucker's still probably going to have a voice in this, but it's more than just him. And I have to say this, is that to me, it is just absolutely pathetic that there are, members of Congress that think that we should essentially march lockstep with the Zelensky government, which is increasingly authoritarian, which is increasingly corrupt and increasingly reckless in how it persecutes the war. And a lot of these people actually didn't like Zelensky 4 or 5 years ago. He's like, oh, he was the peace candidate. He's this comedian like Jon Stewart. We shouldn't take him seriously. And now he's their hero. And I think that Tucker rightly reflected a lot of outrage at the fact that we had elected officials that are supposed to be putting American interests first, that were subordinating not just our interests, but our safety to the Jon Stewart of Ukraine. And the fact that Tucker was willing to say that every night, and the fact that so many people were angered by it, was a good thing and a reflective of where this debate is heading.
Yeah. What is the corollary to the sort of propeller head approach on fiscal issues in the foreign policy domain? The sort of naive idealism compared to sort of effective pragmatism. Like what would the process of actually, in a stepwise way, starting to wind down some of our insane commitments abroad actually look like, implemented through some of the work that you guys are doing and others are?
Well, I think an example of this is a paper we put out a couple months ago. It was written with Sumantra Mitra, who's a senior fellow of ours. I think you've had him on the show before. It's basically our roadmap to the United States significantly reducing its commitment in Europe and pursuing what we call dormant NATO strategy. It's not cutting our security relationship with Europe, but it is recognizing that the current structure, the current NATO structure where the United States is still the primary security guarantor of a wealthy continent, is just no longer viable. Mm-hmm. And it's a roadmap to how you actually achieve that. And you do it by essentially the United States withdrawing almost all its troops, forcing Europeans to step up, maintaining a very narrow security relationship focused on protecting sea lanes and preserving a relationship, particularly with the nuclear powers, France and UK. Mm-hmm. And those are the types of things that we're working on and producing. And there's a lot more of that going on, I think, on the right. The actual granular policy proposals, people like Bridge Colby, with his work around how you pursue denial strategy in East Asia and others. It's the other side, the foreign policy elite, that is not kind of just like with the budget fight, is just recycling the same garbage they've been putting out for the last 20 years. And instead of reckoning with real issues, like, for example, the fact we have a defense industrial base that can't even produce enough shells to sustain the Ukrainian army, and they'll, saying, how do we get to a place where we can actually replenish our stockpiles and prepare for a potential conflict with China, is instead you have, so-called august foreign policy scholars just simply saying, this is a matter of national will. This is a matter of just simply turning up production and not actually recognizing, with the somewhat scary reality, that we can't just turn a knob and, like in World War II, convert a typewriter factory into M1 Garand factory overnight. That this is going to be a long, drawn-out process.
We don't have typewriter factories anymore. We have an entire continent of email jobs.
Exactly. And I just point out there's a story that recently came out, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, about how the United States, in their efforts to ramp up shell production, we're already behind schedule because we don't have enough skilled labor. Our infrastructure isn't enough. We don't have enough of the supply chains. So you have people, I think, increasingly within our movement, they're coming up with ideas to reckon with that, to make serious trade-offs, where the other side, again, is hand-waving it away and just throwing out pablum about national will and, global democracy and all this other garbage, and they aren't the serious ones. We are the ones that are taking these problems seriously and being realistic and sober about the world.
I actually think I was truly blackpilled during Afghanistan, which people can go watch.
Oh yeah, we did an
Previous
episode about it. You were yelling.
Yeah, because at that moment, everyone was just lying about why we should stay in Afghanistan, which I was told was one of the core things that Trump ran on, and it was actually one of the major failures of the Trump administration. Everyone basically just bifurcated amongst like culture war lines and basically lied to Americans about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which 2 years later, all the claims are, let's just take a moment because I enjoy doing this. How many American citizens were taken hostage and killed by the Taliban? Zero. Have there been mass killings of American translators and all these other people who were left behind in the Taliban regime? No. Has there been any major terrorist attack that has been mounted from Afghanistan? No. Have we been able to take out high-level al-Qaeda leadership even though we have no ISR remaining in the country? Yes. So what was the purpose of the whole thing? Oh, you just wanted to stay so girls could go to school. Okay, then say it. Say it though. And they'll never admit any of those that they got blatantly and totally wrong. Let's not to mention, let's say, how can you save your beloved Ukraine if we have got, hundreds of billions of dollars that we continue to pour into Afghanistan? These people don't live in the real world. You and I are living it right now. Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley are warmongering on Iran. It's like, how many wars do people want us to fight? You want us to fight in Russia? You want to fight in Iran? It's like, at what point do we have to make like real world choices and actual trade-offs? So look, it's with the institutional left and frankly on the right, I just realized I'm like, oh, actually nothing changed. Afghanistan was the real like mask off moment for me because I saw all of the neocons rocket right back to power on the right, and they were just using like fake MAGA talking points to get their status.
Yeah, you just yell peace through strength.
Exactly, peace through strength, and all this other nonsense. And that was it. And remember, they were in charge on Ukraine for a long time. We have not won the Ukraine fight at all. I want to be very clear. How many senators agree with us? Maybe five ish.
About a dozen.
All right, maybe. And on a good day, we'll vote that way. Not even, but remember, some of them won't vote that way for the right reason because they disagree on the strategy. It's for like fiscal reasons, which I mean, I'll take it, on the vote, but in terms of like what they actually think, they still mostly agree with the uniparty. So, all right, that's the very tiny majority of the party, maybe half the House of Representatives. I will say great credit to Matt Gaetz, Warrior Gates, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. They got it done. Matt removed Kevin McCarthy, which there's a lot of things to say about that, but I do think that it set the stage such that $100 billion is not going towards Ukraine. But it's still, I mean,
we might never get another Ukraine aid bill. That could happen.
I wouldn't put it past them. I remember this. This is their number one agenda. This is their number one concern. Except maybe number two now because of Israel. But that's a whole other conversation. So the point, though, is that it really revealed to me like the fetish that they actually have for like the Atlantic Alliance, and really fundamentally is their view is just so misguided. It's wrong. It is emotional. None of it has to do with actually American. And they all invent all these fake rhetorical schemes which just don't pass muster at all. They're like, the way to stand up to China is to
this has become
Russia.
The new shibboleth is like everything that we always wanted, but now the gloss is China as opposed to like, everything else.
Wait, hold on a second. What? So we're depleting all of our military stockpiles, engaged in an endless war and supporting in a great power conflict in an area of the world which its GDP share is rapidly diminishing. Meanwhile, our actual allies who are useful and actually pay their bills and produce useful things are under threat in the East. And no. So by pouring all of our attention and stockpiles over here, that's how we support it them over there. It doesn't even pass the smell test at a very basic level, but you just invent these things like out of whole cloth. Or then the other one is like, we're depleting our greatest enemy's military for only 5% of our military budget. I'm like, yeah, well, we're also getting ourselves closer to a nuclear exchange for only 5%. Or no, so it's either a good deal or it's actually a terrible deal.
That 12 hours where a missile fell into Poland.
Oh my God.
And like people were like, all right, boys, it's time for Article 5.
Yeah.
It's like every day that this conflict continues is an opportunity for a black swan event that could cause untold damage to the world.
And by the way, don't forget what happened. Zelensky lied. He's never been held to account for that. He immediately blamed Poland. He's never apologized to the Polish people, something that they only recently woke up to. And I mean, everyone in the Biden administration, we all just decided to move on, including many in the Uniparty people on the right. So I do not think that this war is this war within the right has been won at all. I think that for a moment there's a temporary win behind the people who agree with us on their backs, but I would not put it past them. I mean, this Israel situation, they could easily get it done, tying all three. I just saw that's the administration's plan. They want to tie border security, Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine all together and pass it, which is, you got to give it to them. They do at least rhetorically know what they're doing. Luckily, so far, even people like Marco Rubio have said that's not going to happen. Jim Jordan said that's not going to I don't know. You and I are speaking at a very tumultuous moment. I don't know who the hell is going to be the speaker. That said, I do not expect $100 billion package to pass. Yeah. Maybe $6 billion. I don't know. I don't know what that will look like. But that's still, that we'll take it.
Give me your lay of the land on the state of play with Ukraine right now. What do you think the basic summary of the strategic posture of the United States is right now, Ukraine, Russia, the different competing factions in Europe? And then after that, I'm going to ask you to predict what's going to happen. So,
excellent. I think the headline is Ukraine war is in a stalemate, but it's not really, right? Because if you think about the structure of this conflict, it's not both sides are not equally powerful, right? Russia has substantial material advantages, substantial industry advantages, manpower advantages, right? To the degree Ukraine is able to sort of match or more to the point, like mitigate those advantages, it's only with substantial foreign aid, right? So in a vacuum, we may be at a stalemate today in the battlefield, and Ukraine should be able to do, so long as it's on the defensive, do more with less. But this is a lopsided contest. So to the degree, and I, my personal opinion is that we do have an interest in Ukraine being able to defend itself and to deter Russia from attacking in the future, right? Like, I think that is important just as a matter of, preserving depth on NATO's eastern frontier. I think it's, a useful thing in general to end the cycle of conflict. That's been going on now for a decade. I think these are good things, right? But this is a case where the journey matters in some cases as much as the destination. How do you get there? Given the lopsided nature of the contest, you can get there ostensibly with the United States continuing to pour resources in, right? But, for reasons we've discussed and others, like, that's not a viable solution. It's not. Mostly because we have higher priorities and very limited resources with which to service all of them. So that puts us in a place where if you want Ukraine to be able to defend itself effectively and deter Russia, thereby bringing this war to a conclusion and ending the cycle of conflict, Europe has to provide the bulk of the military aid for it to do so. In terms of weapons, it's in terms of industrial support, so Ukraine can produce what it needs to a certain degree as well, right? And other things. This is kind of where we are in the conflict today. We are in this sort of transition. We are moving from a place where the U.S. has allowed Ukraine to contest, right, Russia's advantages, resulting in, an earlier successful counteroffensive. This counteroffensive was not successful, and now, an opportunity to be on the defensive and potentially hold the line, right? We are transitioning out of that phase, it seems, right? What comes next? We're not sure, right? If Europe steps up, you can imagine that, just by virtue of some of the production, Europe having to ramp up production to other things, right? Even if they do it with all urgency, you would imagine that, it'll be some time before Ukraine gets the weapons it needs from Europe to, mount another sustained counteroffensive, right? So you sort of factor that in. But if we move in that direction, Europe does move with urgency, you could expect a world where, some rocky shoals now, notwithstanding, you get to a place where now Ukraine can in fact get to those outcomes, right? If Europe does not, then I don't know. I think that's a world where I mean, you just look at the map where Russia has substantial advantages. If Europe is not going to help Ukraine mitigate those, then folks can sort of do the math.
So Europe has enjoyed the ability to very affordably give facial support to Ukraine throughout this war because the United States was bearing the substantial supermajority of the cost. How deep do you think that strategic support actually is in Europe? Are there certain countries or forces on the continent that are more invested in it or less? If the rubber met the road, suppose it's very clear that no more Ukraine aid can pass in the United States, who would be the first to cave and say, let's wrap this up and move on to a new strategic status quo?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I think you're completely right. There's a diversity of views, right? Folks in Eastern Europe, the Balts, the Poles, like they get it, right? They're right there. They have committed a lot of aid. They've committed a lot to their own defenses, and they're very much leading in that regard. You look past them, especially at Germany, France, others, especially Germany, and that very much becomes sort of the swing state, right? Where Germany goes matters a lot just by virtue of scale. It's hard to say. I will say this though, it is entirely plausible to me that it becomes clear the U.S. is no longer going to provide all this, and you see this like general softening of positions, in Paris and Berlin and other spots, enough that like basically, okay, we're gonna acquiesce, right, and try to come to a quick resolution, and take what we can get. The basic challenge there is that so long as the structural asymmetry I described earlier, so long as Russia wants all of Ukraine and has those lopsided advantages, then you should expect this cycle of conflict to continue, right? Because you'd have a ceasefire, you'd have both sides sort of consolidate, but Russia would be expected to consolidate more, right, and be more powerful on the back end of it, still have those sort of imperial ambitions, and then try again, and we're sort of back in the same cycle.
Whereas Ukraine immediately has to rebuild a country that barely exists
right,
anymore.
exactly. And without, the foreign military that would have allowed them to, hold the line in the first place, they're going to have a hard time building the military required to do, right? Like you've sort of hit pause, but you haven't fundamentally changed the outcome, right? So even if European countries, thinking about Germany in particular, convince themselves that, okay, we'll just roll over and that'll be the end of it. Like, just from a realist's perspective, that seems unlikely to work, right? You may delay some of this. You may sort of put some time on the clock, but you're not materially changing the underlying factors to make war likely. They will have to deal with this again. Now, having said that, there was a moment when it seemed like Berlin was going to do something differently. In the earliest part of the conflict, February 22, I recall, the tone, down to sort of the interpersonal dynamics, of the Germans was very different. There was a sense of fear. There's a sense of recognition that, oh my gosh, something has changed and we have to do differently, right? This is when it looked like there was an expectation that the Russians would be able to take Kyiv quickly and that Ukraine would effectively cease to exist. And then Germany's Polish buffer would be on the front lines, right? They would no longer have Ukraine and, Poland and the Balts, right, sort of shielding them. Like, no, you'd have, Russian forces in Belarus and Ukraine, then Poland would be sort of the last line before Germany's at risk. And in that moment is when it seemed more than I'd ever seen before or heard before that Germany was prepared to do the heavy lifting. But then, like we were saying before, Captain America swooped in. And again, not to say that there aren't certain things that we, rightly helped the Ukrainians with, but overall the policy has served to reduce that sort of perception of threat and urgency and need on the part of Berlin. So all to say, if things change in the battlefield in a way that convince Berlin their interests are in fact in real danger, I can see them doing the right thing. But unfortunately, it seems like it may take that kind of impetus for them to get there.
So do you think that Germany is more likely to stay hawkish on this conflict than France is?
I mean, if past is any indication, you would expect that. the question then becomes, well, how much, right? And how much more than just pure rhetoric? And I think that would be driven more than anything by, again, what's happening. What do they see happening in the battlefield, and what can they reasonably expect to happen by virtue of American policy, right? Like the ideal outcome is they are convinced one way or another that the U.S. will not be able to provide everything that it has. And as a result, unless they do more, then Ukraine will be at a significant military disadvantage. And then, there's substantially increased risk that the Russians make advances, right? If Berlin's convinced of that, then ideally they change course at that time preemptively rather than waiting for that actually to happen.
This is a kind of a strange question. The world is kind of out of practice of doing armistices. It hasn't, and it certainly hasn't happened in very recent times, in the social media age and the democracy versus autocracy framework of foreign policy age. Do you think that, a conventional both sides come to the table armistice agreement that is anything other than Ukraine gets everything that it wants and Russia gets nothing is even politically tenable in Western life? Like, would there be pressure on the Biden administration or the British or France and Germany to reject anything that seems to be giving Putin a win for this war? Are we just less capable in the West of being realistic about bringing these conflicts to an end?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it kind of gets to the heart of the matter, right? Similar to what we were talking before about hubris, right? Like this is in some ways a learning experience in a fundamental sense, right? You cannot have it all. War is a great teacher, right? Like, there will definitely be pressure. But there's also the reality that under no foreseeable conditions are the Ukrainians going to get Crimea back militarily, right? That's hard, right? Now, does that mean Europeans or whomever has to agree in an armistice to formally acknowledge that, Russia owns it? These are things that diplomats will dispute at the table, but there are certain realities that have to be grappled with. And I think, as this goes on, it becomes harder and harder and harder to ignore those realities. And so, when there comes a time to negotiate a conclusion to this conflict, those will be the facts that Europeans have to deal with, and Americans too, whether they want to or not. And, you can find different ways to sort of, take the edge off some aspects of that in negotiations and the final framing and messaging and all the rest, the contents of whatever particular document. But, so long as Russia maintains the ability to impose certain outcomes and we cannot change that at tolerable cost, then those are outcomes in large measure that we may just have to live with.
So I want to get your temperature check on the current state of mind of the Ukrainians and the Russians. Let's start with the Russians. What exactly does Putin want right now? Where would you say his headspace is at in terms of his goals with the war as they stand right now? I think this is one of the things that's so missing in Washington, is because you basically get chased out of any room if you acknowledge that Russia operates as an independent, rational state actor. You can disagree with the decisions they're making. You can even say that they are engaging in deeply immoral acts, but they have an interest and they're prosecuting it. And so understanding how they think about their own incentives is really important. And it's foolish that DC doesn't do that often enough. So how would you describe it at this moment in time?
Well, I think we have to be very cautious and humble when we think about our ability to get inside Putin's head and to understand his perceptions and what he's thinking. It's important to try to do, but it's a difficult thing to do. And I think we have to do it with a great deal of humility. That's number one. Number two, you can make some informed inferences based on analysis of what he has said over the years and what he's done over the years. And I think when you do that, I think you come away with an impression that he has a very good sense of the threats that he believes the United States and NATO have posed toward Russia. And he's talked a lot about this, right? He looks back at what the West has done over the past several decades, and he sees it as aggressive. Looking at what happened in Kosovo and the Balkans, what happened in Ukraine and Georgia, the degree to which the United States immersed itself in the internal politics of Russia itself. And I think Putin also is convinced that the West has misled him personally, that it has not fulfilled commitments that he believed we had made. Now, our side of the story is very different. We have very different perceptions of what we did, what our intentions were, what Russia did, and all of this. But to say that here are Putin's perceptions is not to say that those perceptions are justified or right. It's not to sympathize with them. It's really to try to understand them so that you get a better sense of what's driving Russian behavior. Now, I think what he is looking for is a grand strategic negotiation with the United States first and foremost, but with the West writ large as well. I think he realizes that Russia can't conquer all of Ukraine. It's a vast country territorially. There are vast portions of Ukraine that will fight tooth and nail in a guerrilla movement, if necessary, against any occupation force that's there, that extends beyond the Donbass area, beyond parts of Ukraine that have been, culturally and linguistically closer to Russia than the western parts of Ukraine. So I don't think his ambition is to have Russian tanks roll all the way to the Polish border or beyond, as is often alleged. I think he realizes that's beyond Russia's capability to try to undertake. But I do think he wants, number one, to make sure that NATO's eastward expansion ends, and that it does not include Ukraine, and that whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of this war is not some sort of base for American military equipment that in turn could threaten Russia in some substantial way. That's number one. Beyond that, I think he's got himself a big security problem in Europe. The Russian conventional military can't begin to contend with a 32-state NATO alliance, with long borders with the Russian Federation, military technology that really is beyond what Russia can offer, and economies and populations that dwarf Russia's overall. And he can't contend with that threat by winning in Ukraine or conquering NATO member states. He's going to have to reach some sort of understanding with the West. And if he can't, then Russia's going to have to rely on its nuclear arsenal to a much greater degree than it has. I think we're probably headed toward a situation, if we don't reach some sort of understanding between the West and Russia on all of this, where Europe is renuclearized in ways that it has not been since the INF Treaty, the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, was signed under Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987. We thought we had turned the page on that chapter of history. Well, it's coming back if we don't find a way to reach a mutually acceptable understanding about European security. Does Putin want that? I think he does. But I think he's also convinced that the powers that have been in the West to this point have no interest in that sort of negotiation. So there's a lot of suspicion on his part, deep mistrust. I think he's felt that he's been lied to over the years, much the way we feel that we've been lied to by the Russians on this. So overcoming those suspicions, overcoming that mistrust is going to be a formidable challenge. But if we're willing to entertain the possibility of some sort of diplomatic understanding, new rules of the game, not dissimilar to the kind of rules of the game that we had during the Cold War, that, yes, are backed by military strength, yes, are backed by robust European military capabilities, but are coupled with serious diplomacy, much the way that Ronald Reagan did it in the 1980s. He certainly negotiated from a position of strength, but he also took advantage of opportunities and wisely, I think, reached accords that made everybody more secure. And I don't think that Putin is opposed to that in principle. He just doesn't think that he's got an interlocutor in the West that's willing to pursue that.
So on the flip side, how would you describe the Ukrainian mentality right now? We're taping this just a couple days after President Zelensky called President Trump and, used language about an end to the war. He might have been playing to his audience in that case, but certainly an interesting development. Are the Ukrainians thinking rationally, irrationally? Are they hoping to wrap this up? How would you describe their mental state right now?
Well, I think if I were in the Ukrainian shoes, I would be very concerned about the situation. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine has been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And, we're going to do this for as long as it takes, leaving out the definition of whatever it is. So our goals have been quite vague, but we have, to this point, really not been very interested in advancing negotiations. And I think from Ukraine's point of view, I think it has good reason to believe that its negotiating leverage may be eroding over time. Why? Well, it's losing a lot of population. I mean, it's at a big disadvantage when it comes to its population relative to Russia. It can't afford to be losing capable soldiers at the rate that it has been for very much longer. Number two, I think it recognizes that popular support in the West for continuing to provide tens of billions of dollars of aid indefinitely is eroding over time. And Ukraine is completely dependent on the United States and Europe for keeping its economy afloat, keeping its government going, and getting the arms and ammunition it needs to continue the war. So they've got to be asking themselves, what do we do if it looks like the gravy train is going to start to end for them? Now, it's also, from Zelensky's point of view, he's got a domestic political problem. He's got a hardline nationalist right that does not want to negotiate, does not want to end this war. They simply want to continue fighting until the Russians are driven off of all Ukrainian territory.
Has that right waxed or waned in influence since the beginning of the war?
Hard to say. I'm not sure that...
I'm assuming a lot of those people are fighting soldiers, many of whom are dying. So in
well, that's right.
terms.
Yeah, right. It's very hard to say. A lot of this information is opaque in a country that's at war. That's quite normal. These are variables that matter a lot to Ukrainian national security, and they're not going to make it easy for anybody to understand what's going on, because people that wish them ill might well take advantage of some of this. That said, if you're going to advance toward some sort of settlement, if you recognize that that's the best alternative you have, to negotiate now before your leverage diminishes even more, to negotiate before your country collapses altogether, and then you're not in a negotiation, you're in a position where Russia dictates terms of a settlement, and they don't want to be in that kind of situation. You need some help politically from the United States. You need the United States to some degree to be the bad guy, meaning Zelensky needs to be able to point to pressure from the United States in some way to deal with his political right, to say to them, hey, look, not up to me. I'm getting all kinds of pressure from Washington. We have to deal with the situation as we're facing it. So we're going to have to understand the reality means we need to negotiate with the Russians. So the kinds of pressure that the United States is putting on Ukraine because of the dynamics of our electoral situation right now can be useful, I think, for Zelensky in trying to negotiate his own situation inside Ukraine. Now, I won't pretend to know what Zelensky himself is thinking in all of this, but if I were in his shoes, I would certainly be talking to Donald Trump and trying to understand better where he's coming from.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.